Prince William stood at the tall window of his Windsor study, watching the last light drain from the winter sky. And for the first time in months, he did not turn when Catherine entered the room. On the desk behind him lay a slim parliamentary folder, its cover unmarked, its contents already reshaping everything he thought he understood about the household he had grown up inside. He had rehearsed his composure for many crises. He had prepared for scandal, for illness, for the slow public erosion that always seemed to follow the crown. He had not prepared for forgery. That mattered because forgery inside a royal decree was not a private embarrassment. It was a wound cut directly into the authority of the monarchy itself. Before the story continues, please subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of what may become the defining constitutional test of this generation. The folder had arrived that morning from the fictional Parliamentary Instruments Committee, a body created within this narrative to review royal orders and authorization records whenever their integrity was called into question. Its findings were narrow but devastating. 3 royal decree entries connected to Queen Camilla's private office contained altered signatures, changed authorization dates, and irregular seal records. A royal decree was a formal written order carrying the sovereign's personal authority, which meant these were not clerical slips buried in a filing cabinet. They were instruments of power, and if Parliament was correct, those instruments had been quietly reshaped inside the very household that was meant to guard them. William read the executive summary once, then read it again. That mattered because he was searching, in his second reading, for the escape clause every royal crisis usually contained, the phrase that allowed the palace to call something a misunderstanding. He did not find it. Instead, he found a sentence that stopped him entirely. The forgeries, the summary said, had not appeared on a single night. They had accumulated across several months. Catherine watched him from the doorway. She had learned, over the long years of marriage, to read the small shifts in his posture, the way his shoulders lowered when the burden became constitutional rather than personal. She did not speak at first. She simply crossed the room and placed one hand on the edge of the desk, close enough to be present, far enough not to intrude. When she finally asked whether Charles had seen the file yet, William answered without turning. He had not. That mattered because the person most damaged by the discovery had not yet been told, and the person most likely to have benefited from the decrees was already inside the palace with him. The disputed decrees, according to the annex, had shaped decisions involving private royal collections, ceremonial permissions, and household appointments. One of them, William noted, had been logged on an evening when Charles was demonstrably away from the palace, attending a fictional Commonwealth cultural reception in Edinburgh. Yet the authorization line on the document stated, in unmistakable language, that personal sovereign approval had been granted that same night. That detail mattered because it removed the last comfortable explanation. A misfiled date could be a mistake. A misplaced seal could be carelessness. But an authorization that placed the king inside a room he had never entered was something else entirely. It was an act of construction. William closed the folder hard enough to break the silence in the study. He turned to Catherine and told her only 4 words. "Father cannot hear this alone." She understood immediately, because she understood what was really being said. William was not simply protecting his father from information. He was protecting the king from the moment of realizing that a document carrying his name had been forged inside his own home. They did not reach Charles first. Before they could leave the study, a discreet knock brought a message from the king's household. Camilla had already been informed that Parliament had released its findings, and she had requested a private meeting with Charles before anyone else could reach him. That mattered because it transformed the sequence of the crisis. William was no longer arriving with a warning. He was arriving after a door had already closed. He stood for a moment with the message in his hand, and Catherine watched the calculation move across his face. The question was no longer only what the decrees had done. The question was what Camilla had stood to gain from them, and, more painfully, what she now stood to lose. The parliamentary file named documents, but behind every document stood people, and each of them, from The king to the queen consort, to the future king himself, now carried something devastating at risk. William carried two burdens at once. As heir, he was expected to defend the stability of a monarchy he might one day lead. As a son, he could already imagine the expression that would settle on his father's face when the folder was opened. The heir to the throne was the person next in line to become monarch, which meant every decision William made in the coming hours would eventually be judged against the kind of king he intended to become. Several rooms away, Charles was already alone with a preliminary brief. He had removed his reading glasses and placed them beside the folder with the deliberate care of a man buying himself a few more seconds before the world reorganized itself. He asked his private secretary a single question: whether William had received the full version. And when the answer came back that his son had seen everything, the king closed his eyes for a moment and said nothing. That restraint mattered because it revealed the shape of the wound. Charles was not surprised by parliamentary criticism. He had lived with public scrutiny for the whole of his life. What he had not learned to survive was betrayal inside the household he had rebuilt so carefully around Camilla. Camilla waited in another wing and refused every gesture from her aides. She did not want talking points. She did not want a rehearsed statement. She wanted Charles. Yet the longer he failed to summon her, the more her frustration gave way to something quieter and more corrosive. The queen consort had spent decades constructing a fragile acceptance inside the royal family, and now records connected to her private office threatened to convert that acceptance into permanent suspicion. When an aide asked whether she wanted William informed of her willingness to speak, she answered no. Then, after a long pause, she asked how long the king had been alone with the file. Inside the study, Catherine had continued reading the supporting material. And it was she who found the detail that shifted the crisis from constitutional to personal. One of the disputed decrees had adjusted internal access rules governing objects historically connected with Diana's private collection, pieces that had been carefully protected across the years since her death. Catherine told him carefully, choosing each word, because she understood what the information would do. William stared at the page without speaking. That mattered because items linked to his mother were not abstract assets on an inventory sheet. They carried memory, grief, and a history the family had never entirely closed. The forgery, whatever its administrative purpose, had brushed against the one part of his life he had always kept beyond the reach of palace politics. Then Princess Anne entered the crisis, and the story acquired its first witness. In a documented, private account prepared for the fictional review, Anne told William that she remembered questioning one of the decrees when it had first appeared months earlier. The wording had struck her as wrong. Charles, she said, simply did not authorize things in that language. The Princess Royal repeated the observation twice, because she wanted her nephew to understand that suspicion had existed inside the family, long before Parliament ever formalized it. She had noticed the problem, she had raised the problem, and the problem had been quietly buried. Charles finally crossed the corridor to the room where Camilla was waiting. She rose the moment he entered, but he did not move toward her. Instead, the monarch placed the parliamentary file on the table between them and looked directly at his wife. He asked her, in the flat voice of a man who had already read too much, to explain why her office was named inside it. Camilla did not answer at once. And in that silence, Anne's earlier warning suddenly mattered more than ever, because the answer reached back to one specific night, months before, when a single decree had first appeared and something inside Windsor had gone quietly, catastrophically wrong. The night in question had followed a fictional Windsor heritage reception, a private gathering connected to the care and ceremonial use of historic royal objects. Charles had been away at another engagement. William and Catherine had already left. That left Anne as the most senior family member still present when a late authorization arrived at the household team carrying language that transferred temporary control over selected royal collection decisions to Camilla's private office. The paperwork claimed sovereign approval. It did not have it. That mattered because the decree, if accepted, would allow one household office to approve the movement and ceremonial use of specific pieces without the usual level of direct review by the king himself. Anne read the approval line twice. Two aides stood nearby as she placed one finger beneath the sovereign authorization and told them, in the level voice she reserved for moments she did not intend to lose, that she would not endorse anything until Charles confirmed it personally. Her suspicion had not been rooted in family rivalry. She knew her brother's habits. She knew the cadence of his written approvals. The wording felt too broad, too clean, and too convenient. More importantly, the instruction gave one household office quiet control over objects that carried both family history and public meaning. If the authorization was false, someone had not merely bent procedure. Someone had borrowed the king's authority. Camilla had confronted her later that same night. In a documented private account preserved within the fictional record, the queen consort insisted that the change was administrative and accused Anne of turning routine household management into a personal question of trust. The princess had refused to soften her position. She had stood across from Camilla after midnight and said, "If Charles approved this, let him tell me himself." Camilla remained silent for several long seconds. Then she left without answering the central question. That mattered because silence, inside a royal household, was almost never neutral. It was almost always a choice. The true danger surfaced much later, and it surfaced quietly. When Parliament recovered the finalized internal log from that night, Anne's objection was missing entirely. In its place, the entry stated that the decree had been received without challenge. That single phrase transformed suspicion into something darker. A backup registry then exposed a timestamp, showing that the record had been modified almost 40 minutes after her objection was first entered. That mattered because an ordinary aide could not have altered a protected registry after the fact. The access required senior authorization. The trail pointed directly toward Camilla's senior office. Anne's warning was no longer old family friction. It was evidence that someone had rewritten the night itself. William felt the meaning of the recovered sequence the instant he saw it. He did not summon advisors. He did not ask palace lawyers to sit between them. When Camilla was finally brought to a private Windsor drawing room, the prince was already waiting with the parliamentary file closed beside him. Neither spoke at first. Then William asked one question. Why had Anne's objection vanished from the official record? Camilla answered immediately and firmly that she had never forged a royal decree. But William was no longer asking only about signatures. He was asking who had rewritten history. He opened the file and placed Parliament's reconstructed timeline between them. It contained Anne's remembered objection, the altered registry entry, and the wording of the disputed decree. A parliamentary access record was, in plain terms, a technical log showing who entered or changed protected records and when, and this one had become crucial because it could separate an innocent administrative mistake from a deliberate act. The prince reminded Camilla that the original complaint had not merely been overlooked. It had been replaced by language claiming the decree had been received without challenge. That mattered because passive omission and active replacement were different crimes, and only one of them required intent. Camilla held her ground. She told him that her household office processed documents prepared by senior staff every day, and that administrator responsibility did not mean she personally authored every line carrying her office's approval. She had trusted, she said, experienced officials to handle procedure correctly. William listened, but the anger sharpened behind his stillness. He told her that the issue was no longer whether she had physically altered a record. The real question was whether she had benefited from powers she knew Charles had never clearly granted. That mattered because the crown, unlike a private institution, could not be defended by claiming ignorance of one's own authority. Sovereign power exercised without sovereign knowledge was not delegation. It was theft. Camilla reacted the moment Diana's collection entered the conversation. She accused William of allowing grief to convert a records inquiry into a verdict on her entire place within the family. The prince did not raise his voice. That restraint made his reply harder to answer. He said his mother's history mattered because one disputed decree had adjusted access to objects carrying deep family meaning. But he would have challenged the record even if Diana's name had never appeared anywhere inside it. For him, the danger was authority being used without clear consent, and that danger did not need a personal wound to be real. Then William turned to the strongest piece of evidence in the file. Parliament's access log showed that Camilla's private authorization code had been used minutes before one of the disputed decrees was finalized. The room fell silent. She looked at the entry twice before admitting, in a documented private account later given to the fictional review, that one senior household official had been permitted to use that code when acting in her name. Camilla insisted she had never instructed anyone to falsify a decree, but the explanation widened the crisis rather than closing it. That mattered because the moment she confirmed the shared code, she confirmed that the mechanism of the forgery had lived, however unknowingly, inside her own office. Camilla reached toward the folder, an instinctive gesture, as though physical possession of the paper might yet contain the damage. William placed his hand on it first. "Father," he told her quietly, "reads this before anything else disappears." She stopped immediately. The prince closed the file and stood, now certain that the mystery had grown larger than one signature, one office, or one damaged relationship. Yet even William could not decide what happened next, because the power to recognize or destroy the disputed decrees rested beyond that closed room. Charles was about to be forced into the most painful decision of a reign already defined by painful decisions. The king sat with the parliamentary findings, the original decree copies, and the recovered registry timeline while senior legal advisors explained, in careful language, what invalidation would mean. Beside him sat Anne. She did not press him. She did not need to. Charles was being forced to choose between protection and truth. He turned to the first decree and read it slowly. The sovereign's legal secretariat, a fictional team responsible for verifying whether royal orders had been properly approved and recorded, had begun reviewing all three documents after Parliament's report. That mattered because a royal decree only carried authority if the monarch had knowingly approved it. If that approval had been copied, stretched, or invented, every decision resting on the document could collapse with it. Charles stopped at one passage. He told the advisors quietly that he remembered discussing the wider issue months earlier, but he did not remember approving the wording now sitting before him. The king read the sentence again, then looked toward Anne. She watched her brother carefully because she understood the cost of what he was admitting. Accepting that the record was irregular could humiliate Camilla publicly. Refusing to accept it could leave the crown defending an authority that might never have existed. Anne did not offer comfort. She offered memory. She repeated that the original decree had troubled her because it gave one office unusually broad discretion without demanding fresh approval from Charles. That mattered because her memory, now vindicated by Parliament, was no longer a private grievance. It was contemporaneous evidence. Charles found the phrase that decided everything. It transferred discretion to Camilla's household office without requiring further sovereign review. He said, so quietly that Anne almost missed it, that he would never have approved such language. The room changed immediately. That was no longer an uncertain memory. It was a direct rejection from the only person whose authorization could have made the decree valid in the first place. Then Charles made the decision he had been avoiding since the file arrived. He ordered all three disputed decrees frozen at once and suspended every authority created by them until the investigation was complete. The king understood exactly what this meant. One of those powers had guided decisions inside Camilla's office for months. Freezing it would not remain hidden for long. He picked up his fountain pen. He hesitated once, then signed the suspension order. Anne watched him place the pen down and understood that her brother had chosen the institution over silence. The signature took only seconds, but by the time Camilla was told what Charles had done, the world around her had already changed. Camilla received the news without shouting. That made the silence more painful. The three disputed decrees were suspended. Her office could no longer exercise the powers derived from them. Staff were ordered to preserve access records, correspondence logs, authorization books, and internal schedules for review. Then came the detail that struck hardest. Charles himself had signed the restriction. She asked everyone to leave. When the door closed, the Queen Consort remained seated, staring at an office that suddenly no longer felt entirely hers. That mattered because the room had been the physical expression of every yard of ground she had gained inside the family, and the ground had shifted beneath her without warning. Responsibility for the contested decisions had been transferred back to Charles's central household administration, the core office that handled royal business directly under the monarch's authority. Camilla learned something else that cut deeper still. Charles had signed the restriction without consulting her first. She had expected anger. She had expected difficult questions. She had not expected to be treated as a subject rather than a partner. That mattered because for years they had survived public pressure together, and the withdrawal of consultation was, in its own quiet way, a withdrawal of standing. Charles passed her private office later that evening. He slowed. He did not enter. The king knew she was inside. She knew he was outside. Neither crossed the distance. That single decision carried more pain than another argument could have done. Then investigators found the pattern. In a documented analysis prepared for the Fictional Records Review, each altered decree had expanded the authority available to Camilla's household while simultaneously reducing the need for secondary approval. Another access log connected the same senior official Camilla had earlier mentioned to all three document processing windows. This was no random chain of mistakes. Someone had repeatedly used trusted access at the exact moments the records changed. William expected that discovery to push his father even further away from Camilla. Instead, a message arrived from Charles. The king wanted to see his son privately. No lawyers, no advisors, no aides. And when Charles finally chose to speak from the heart, it was not Camilla he called for. It was William. There were no officials in the room when William entered. No parliamentary folders stacked between them. No legal advisors waiting to translate every sentence into constitutional language. Charles stood near the fireplace and asked his son to close the door. Then the king admitted what William had been afraid to hear. He no longer knew which part hurt more. The possibility that Camilla had known what was happening, or the possibility that she had trusted someone who used her authority without telling her. That mattered because those two possibilities required different responses, and Charles was being asked to build a policy out of a wound whose depth he could not yet measure. William's anger changed instantly. It did not disappear. It reorganized itself around a father he suddenly saw more clearly than he had in years. Charles spoke more quietly after that. The initial investigation had connected one senior official to repeated access across all three altered records, but it had not yet proved who had ordered the changes. Reauthentication, the king explained, meant checking each decree again from the beginning and confirming that every approval was genuine before any authority could be restored. That mattered because the crisis was no longer only about paperwork. It was about whether a husband could still trust his wife, whether a son could still trust his father's household, and whether the future king could defend an institution without destroying the people inside it. Charles finally admitted the humiliation he had been carrying. He told William that someone had treated his signature as if it could be reconstructed whenever convenient. The king said the idea disturbed him more than any headline ever could, because sovereign approval was supposed to be personal, deliberate, and unmistakable. William listened differently now. He still felt anger, but he also saw a father trying to understand how authority carrying his own name had moved through rooms he thought he controlled. William answered carefully. He told Charles that protecting Camilla could not mean protecting false records. Yet the prince also refused to condemn her for actions investigators had not personally tied to her. That distinction mattered. He wanted accountability, not revenge. His father looked at him for several seconds before revealing through a documented private account, later preserved in the fictional review, that Camilla had already admitted something painful. She knew her office had been exercising unusually broad discretion, but she had believed the paperwork behind it had been properly authorized. Charles then made the turning point clear. Every disputed decree would be re-authenticated directly. The senior official linked to the access logs would lose all protected system access immediately. Camilla's delegated powers would remain suspended until fresh approval was granted it through a verified process. William agreed. For the first time since Parliament opened the records, father and son were no longer arguing about who should be protected. They were deciding what truth required. By sunrise, the crisis no longer belonged to Windsor. It belonged to Britain. Newspaper stands carried the same extraordinary theme. Royal authority had been altered inside the machinery designed to protect it. Broadcasters abandoned normal schedules for live constitutional analysis. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace, some angry, others simply stunned, many waiting in a stillness that felt more eloquent than any chant. But one image captured the mood better than any headline. A silent row of people watching the palace gates as Parliament's findings were read aloud on their phones. William watched the first broadcasts beside Catherine and felt the private crisis become something much larger. News organizations stressed that the controversy concerned 3 disputed decree records, not the legal existence of the monarchy itself, but that distinction offered little emotional comfort. Re-authentication, the commentators repeated, meant checking every affected royal order again and confirming that the sovereign had genuinely approved it. Charles had already ordered that process, because leaving even one false authority untouched could damage confidence in every legitimate decision around it. That mattered because trust in a monarchy was not built decree by decree. It was built by the belief that every decree was real. Camilla listened from another room as her name dominated the coverage. She remained composed until one presenter asked whether Charles could ever fully trust her again. The Queen Consort reached for the remote and switched the television off. That question cut deeper than accusations about administration, because it reached the one judgment Parliament could not make. She had already admitted, through a documented private account, that her office had operated with more freedom than she had realized. Now the country was quietly asking whether that failure had also damaged her marriage. Then the decisive parliamentary finding arrived. A fictional newspaper splashed the words, "Who signed for the king," across its front page beside conflicting decree dates. Minutes later, Parliament confirmed that the senior household official had used credentials belonging to Camilla's office to alter all 3 records. Investigators found no evidence that Charles had personally approved those alterations. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowd fell unusually quiet as a broadcaster announced that the altered entries were formally invalidated. One person lowered a newspaper. The palace gates remained closed. The mechanism was exposed. The records were dead. The official responsible had been identified. But one final judgment remained, and only Charles could make it. What responsibility did Camilla carry for allowing power exercised in her name to become the doorway through which the deception had entered the crown? The final decision did not erase what had happened. It did something harder. It named responsibility. Charles confirmed that all 3 disputed decrees were permanently void. The senior official who manipulated the records was dismissed from royal service and referred for formal investigation within the fictional storyline. Camilla retained her position beside the king, but the extraordinary administrative powers connected to her private office were withdrawn. William supported the decision, not because the family had escaped damage, but because the crown had finally stopped protecting comfort at the expense of truth. Charles ordered every decision that depended solely on the falsified records to be reviewed and reversed where necessary. The king also removed independent decree processing authority from Camilla's household, meaning future permissions would require documented approval through his central office. That mattered because a royal decree was not simply another piece of palace paperwork. It carried the monarch's authority. If that authority could be stretched without direct approval, then every legitimate decision around it risked being questioned as well. The sovereign had chosen a painful correction rather than an easier silence. Charles met Camilla privately before the final family discussion. He told her that he accepted the investigation had not shown she personally altered the records. But he also told the Queen Consort that trust carried responsibility for what was done under her name. Camilla did not argue. In a documented private account preserved within the fictional review, she acknowledged that she had allowed too much freedom inside her office without demanding direct confirmation. She accepted the restrictions. For her, the consequence was not removal from the family. It was something quieter and harder. Living with the knowledge that confidence, once freely given, would now have to be earned again in small increments. Across years, she was no longer certain she had. William received the authenticated replacement registry later that day beside Catherine. The princess watched him reach the entry connected to Anne's original objection. It had been restored to the permanent historical record exactly where it belonged. The prince read it once, then closed the register slowly. He told Catherine that the lesson was bigger than Camilla, Charles, or even himself. Royal authority could survive disagreement. It could survive embarrassment. It could not survive if people inside the system were allowed to manufacture consent and call it loyalty. That mattered because loyalty, misused, was the single force capable of destroying a monarchy from the inside, and no external critic could ever match its damage. Charles placed that corrected registry on the table during the final private family meeting. Anne read her restored objection and said nothing afterward. Camilla lowered her gaze. William closed the cover. Nobody celebrated. The senior official was gone. The false decrees were dead. The Queen Consort's authority had been narrowed, and the king's approval system had been rebuilt around direct verification. The Princess Royal had been vindicated, and the future king emerged from the crisis more determined than ever that transparency would define the monarchy he might one day inherit. That became the lasting verdict of the scandal. The monarchy could survive embarrassment, division, and painful truth. But the moment it allowed authority itself to be forged, it risked losing the one thing no crown can rule without: trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.